Hi, I'm Taylor.
And I'm Allison.
And you're listening to
the Conscious Health Podcast.
Are you bombarded by nutrition myths daily? Do you feel overwhelmed, unsure, and confused? Well, we've got you covered because on this week's episode, we'll be discussing how to navigate nutrition information in media and society.
I'm excited to get into this topic because I feel like there's so much information nowadays that's so easily accessible regarding nutrition that it can be really tricky for a lot of people to decipher what's true and what's false.
Well, the thing is, there's just so much. Like, you're just inundated with so much information from every which way. There's opposing ideas. This is what I get from most of my family members. 1 week, eggs are good. The next week, they're not. I hear that all the time. They're like, well, what's with that? And I'm thinking a lot of it is the misinterpretation and people being unable to translate research, which I think is a big issue.
Yeah, because nowadays you can find information regarding nutrition and well-being pretty much anywhere you look. You can go on Facebook, for example, and, probably your friends and family are sharing these different posts that are promoting a certain diet. Or you could turn on the TV and there's commercials for different nutritional products or different kind of like advertisements promoting one way of eating, another way of eating. Of course, all over social media, you have these lifestyle gurus that make like what I eat in a day videos.
I think that might be, well, that's more of a recent change to media, and that is a huge influence on how people eat and live and what they consume and buy.
Literally ask anyone and people probably have some sort of opinion regarding certain foods. I think the information just gets so diluted and it takes on like a different form, like that's not the original idea that the researcher was trying to get across in like the very first article.
Also, it just takes one study and then something will blow up, and a lot of people, which you can't blame them, it's so difficult to pick apart a study that you can't blame people for just taking it at face value.
No, I'm definitely guilty of that. Like until recently, I remember thinking, if it was published in some sort of scientific journal, this must be true. How can it not be? It's been published, it's been peer reviewed.
Yeah.
But now, like I'm realizing, you really have to look at the study and take into consideration all the different variables and like what they were actually looking at. Their outcomes of interest, so many different things about the article you do have to keep in mind. And it can be really, really difficult to understand the primary literature. And so I think that's also partly why people, they see an article on some sort of news outlet being like, coffee reduces fat. And they see that someone who's part of some sort of news outlet has written an article based on a scientific journal. And if someone doesn't have a scientific background, then obviously it's going to be easier for them to understand this writer from whatever news outlet, what they've written, as opposed to actually reading the article itself. And I think that's one of the first problems that begin. The person writing this article probably isn't versed in scientific knowledge, doesn't have a scientific background to write this article, and then someone else looking at it, and then it just like from there is where it's kind of like a domino effect.
Yeah, it really is, because the majority of people's nutrition information is coming from bloggers, newspaper articles, and, YouTubers and lifestyle gurus, I'm going to call them.
Yeah.
Even though I wouldn't consider them gurus myself. But anyway, for lack of a better term. And these people, they're not trying to publicize false information.
Right.
I think the majority of them are really trying to help people. But the majority of them don't have the scientific background to properly understand and articulate the science and translate that to their audience. Like you were saying, that's a large reason why it's so jumbled and confusing.
Right. And even like nutrition as it is can be a pretty complicated topic. And it doesn't matter what types of scientific articles you're looking at or who's done these studies, because nutrition is so complicated, there's always going to be conflicting results, even within, top scientists.
Yeah, it's not that the study is flawed. It's that there's so many different variables and so many factors they're looking at and so much to consider that sometimes outcomes are different.
Right.
And it can be one slight change, but you have to take them all together because science is inherently microscopic and honed in on one specific topic or a specific pathway, and that's where you see those differing results.
And I think that that's kind of difficult for people to understand because even myself, if I'm looking into some topic, I would obviously prefer that there's one outcome and there's, one side to things, because the second that you're like, oh, you have conflicting results regarding something, it just becomes more and more complicated. So I think that's partially why the information just gets so diluted and why people who are working in the media and producing these articles or videos seem to focus in on one specific study or like one outcome of interest, and they kind of do this cherry picking. So they look for specific articles that support what they're trying to get across, which obviously, if you are trying to get an idea across, that would be an effective way to do it. But at the same time, it doesn't show the people who are going to be reading this or watching these videos that there are other sides to it and it's not so straightforward. But I don't think that the general public likes to see things like that. I feel like they would prefer to have one outcome or another.
Well, because it is complicated and people are coming back from working a long day and they're looking through media. They don't want to dig deeper.
Right.
It's really tedious. And interpreting nutrition information is tedious. I would say it's impossible for one individual to interpret the data. You would need a team to look at all of the science, look at all of the systematic reviews to really fully evaluate what the outcome is.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And because of that, I think a tip that everyone should keep in mind when looking at information regarding nutrition is context. Because it's so easy to just read an article or see a post on Facebook that gives one idea or promotes one concept and not see that it's been taken out of context kind of. So for example, like I was scrolling on Facebook the other day and I saw this post. It was comparing like beef burger to a black bean patty to the Beyond Meat burger. And so basically what it was doing, it just had, cartoon pictures of each one and then it had like the list of ingredients. And if you looked at this post, you would see that the beef burger had just one ingredient, beef. The black bean burger, had a few ingredients. And then the Beyond Meat burger had like a ton of ingredients listed. And so someone looking at that without thinking about it, just seeing the post, would probably assume that the beef burger was maybe the best option, just because this whole thing about like fewer ingredients or more natural ingredients, or if you can't read it or spell it, don't eat it. And so they would look at this and be like, oh, the beef burger is the best option. But then you have to think about it and think about the context, because this picture is comparing like these three different patties. But really, let's say you're eating the Beyond Meat burger. Odds are you've probably gone out to some fast food restaurant to get this Beyond Meat burger. So then if you're comparing that to a patty that they would be selling at a fast food restaurant, it's not going to be just beef, right? Like there's going to be a ton of other ingredients in there. So something like that, like it's so easy to just kind of take it out of context, just see this post and only take one thing from it. But you really have to be a little critical about information. And
I think you're right. People need to be critical, take a critical look at it, because that's only one aspect.
Right, exactly.
Of the food. There's so many other aspects of those foods.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think people just need to really kind of look at the bigger picture and put it into context, because otherwise it's just a post, and not that it's like misleading information, but I feel like it can be kind of manipulated in a way that promotes one thing or another and doesn't like equally share information about both things.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. My second top tip for deciphering information would be to find reputable websites and organizations that you can trust. So these would be highly regarded science organizations or websites. So just some examples, I'm sure you have some too, but Harvard, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine is really great. The World Health Organization, also Health Canada is great.
I know you mentioned Harvard has a website that's a little bit more like user-friendly. Other universities actually have websites similar to that as well. Like you were saying, various organizations or different foundations that are science-based as well.
Yeah, it's probably important to say that the reason these websites are reputable is because they're transparent They're non-commercial, or they're like a non-for-profit, and they're all leaders in the nutrition research arena. That's where you want to be looking. Another great resource is nutritionfacts.org. I tell everyone about this, I'm sure you've heard me say, but it's run by Dr. Michael Greger, and this site is non-commercial, science-based, and it's a public service that he runs, actually. So he provides all transparent and non-funded information for free to the public. It's really great. And you can look up anything. It's very user-friendly. So if you want to know about spirulina, just look up spirulina. He'll have like 3 videos on it.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and he cites all the information. I actually use this a lot for my assignments, I'm not gonna lie. If I'm interested in a certain nutraceutical, I'll look it up, and then he has the best references. Like,
really?
They're always really good references because he uses the best science. Like, he has a whole team. It's super rigorous.
Wow.
Yeah, so he has this team of people that are looking through all the literature, and he creates these bite-sized 5-minute videos that are really easy to absorb, and it just gives you all the information you need pretty much.
Oh, that's awesome. It does sound like a really good resource.
Yeah, there's no ads either on the website. Like, he's really not funded by anything, so you know that you can trust the information on there.
That kind of brings me to another point that I wanted to mention as well. You were talking a lot about funding in terms of different websites or research, and I think it's super important when you're looking at different journal articles or different websites that are maybe citing certain scientific articles to look at where they've gotten their funding from. Because, for example, if you're taking a look at someone's blog post and they've listed a couple different sources, and you take a look at these sources and all of them are funded by like a specific company that maybe makes, you know, some sort of health food, then that can kind of be a red flag that you want to be careful for, because these companies are going to be paying researchers to do research on their products. And so the companies, they're not going to be like, oh, you need to come up with this certain answer. But at the same time, there's still going to be that pressure there on the researcher's part, just that they want to have something to show the company, right? And if it's being company funded, if it's not having like the results that they want, they're probably going to stop funding that study. Larger companies can fund research about their products and cut funding where they want to, but leave it where they're having success, right? So you're only going to see like the successful studies, not the quote unquote unsuccessful studies.
Yeah, I know in science they're trying to change this by having people register their studies beforehand so that every study gets published, because that is a huge issue, and I think it's been going on for a long time. And even with the funding, like, just another point, even if it's, let's say, a blog post, or there's this one site that sometimes I take a look at, Collective Evolution, some sort of news feed, poke around on those websites. If they're promoting a specific product, it's most likely part of an advertisement.
Right.
And if you don't know if you can trust that entity in promoting good products, then you might want to just question it. Again, that critical eye, just, oh yeah, well, how come I see an ad for that product on that blog post? So just keeping that in mind.
And kind of adding on to that as well is if certain products, you know, they're being advertised as successful, if you're seeing, you know, they might have like a study here, they're cited, but if the majority of their information is based on like testimonials, because those are all based on people's good experiences, which is obviously not going to be the same for everyone. And regardless, that's still kind of the same thing, going back to like the funding idea, where they're only going to be showing the good parts of it.
Yeah.
Like, they're not going to have testimonials of someone who hated the product.
Yes, testimonials are not reviews.
Yeah.
They're testimonials.
Exactly.
So a third top tip that we have is use common sense. And this sounds simple, but it can actually be the hardest thing to keep in mind when there's so much chatter in the nutrition field and in media. So you're always just like inundated with information from each side and information from certain people and industries. But it's really easy in that context to lose sight of the big picture. So it's really important to just take a step back when you're consuming this information and gain a broader view. Draw on your own knowledge and experiences. Also use your intuition to guide those conclusions. Think more big picture, kind of like you were saying with the hamburger, it's like, what environmental factors are surrounding that food? Is that the whole picture? For drawing on your own knowledge and experiences, don't doubt yourself. If something feels off, or you have food experiences throughout your life. If you felt that this one food, it just felt really good when you ate it, go with that intuition. Like, if you've really enjoyed eating eggs and it actually makes you feel good, then continue that. Obviously in moderation, but I think we can easily lose sight of being mindful around food too when we're so focused on what is the healthiest. Draw on your bodily cues as well.
Right.
And then using your intuition. So, okay, this is a good example because this is what I kind of tell people when they ask me about coconut oil. It's kind of like a hot topic, a little bit polarizing right now. When coconut oil is at room temp, it's solid. That means it's saturated. Going a step further, what will that do inside your body? It's most likely going to solidify. Just taking those extra steps into thinking it through. And I have seen the science to say that as well. Also, maybe you'll get into this with the science, but when you look at the science and it's so microscopic and kind of unrealistic, they're looking for the maximum result. So, for example, they'll take rats and they'll give them the active ingredient of wine, which is resveratrol, in a very concentrated dose. That would be impossible for a human to consume that through wine. Using your intuition and moving through that idea is like, okay, 1, it's a rat. 2, would you even consume that quantity of whatever chemical they're talking about?
Like you were saying, so important to look at the bigger picture. Also, to look at context as well, because odds are that an article like that, someone has taken that and been like, drink wine every single day because it's good for you. In that case, you would have to take a look at this article that was written and what they had based their review on or their article on. So it's super, super important to take a look at the context in which this information has been taken and how it's been manipulated into, another article or a video, but also look at the bigger picture. A lot of the times, different media outlets will take stories or take articles like this and run with it and kind of twist it around so it supports what they're trying to get across, which is not necessarily what the researchers were intending to get across. So it's really important to do research and kind of come to your own conclusions as well. And adding on to that as well, it's important to look to make sure that there's other studies that support this evidence. I know you've already touched on this briefly, but if you're reading something or hearing about something on some sort of news outlet or on social media, and they're only referring to one study, then I would take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, because, if one study comes out and it's saying that all the other scientific research that we've done is incorrect, that doesn't change science. One study will not change that. It has to be reproduced. I think when you were talking, it was kind of reminding me too how controlled studies are.
Right.
But the world is not controlled.
Yeah.
You are not a controlled participant. I think that's very important to consider because there's so many factors that people need to consider for themselves, and everyone has individual needs and individual abilities regarding food. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when looking at the evidence. There's so many things to keep in mind. Maybe we can dig a little deeper with going along these lines of if someone wants to go deeper into the science and really evaluate the scientific evidence, do you have any other more in-depth tips for people?
Well, I really like the point that you brought up about how you're not a controlled participant in a study. Because that kind of also brings up the idea of looking at the study population, who they were testing. And you're right, studies are very, very controlled. A lot of times, there's some sort of restriction as to what the participants can and cannot consume. And so while it does provide us with valuable information, like you're right, we're not in that sort of setting all the time. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. So also in relation to the study population would be the type of study that's being performed. A lot of times in studies relating to nutrition, it's not going to be as controlled as most researchers would want, because you can't impose a certain diet onto someone. Like, that's just unethical, or tell them like, oh, you can't eat fruit for 2 months.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can't do things like that. So a lot of times in nutrition, most of the studies would be some sort of like observational cohort study. So it's going to follow a population over a certain period of time, or it's going to ask them about their eating habits in the past and then evaluate whether or not they have, you know, some sort of illness or whatever the endpoint is that the researchers were looking at.
Yeah, this really gauges associations.
Right. So it's important to keep that in mind. Not saying that these aren't good studies or that these don't provide us with valuable information, because they do.
Population studies are very important because it is real world. I think we can really learn a lot from them. It's such an important area of study, and it also leads us to those more in-depth studies.
There's one more point that I wanted to mention as well when it comes to looking at scientific literature. So basically, just that it's very easy to kind of take the results of a study out of context and warp them into something that they're not. And what I mean by this is, for example, if a study is looking at how, this is an example, so how like chocolate can affect heart disease, or how it can reduce the incidence of heart disease. For researchers to look at something like that, generally they're not going to wait until the participants actually get heart disease. It's going to take years for something like this to happen. Odds are the researchers aren't going to wait, especially if it's a clinical trial. And so oftentimes they're probably going to be looking at alternative outcomes. And so by this I mean, when you're looking at heart disease, instead of actually looking for incidence of heart disease, they might look at plaque buildup
so
in your arteries.
They're usually the risk factors for that specific disease.
Exactly. And so it's very easy to kind of take that out of context and be like, okay, so they're saying if you eat this amount of chocolate every day, it's going to reduce plaque buildup, and therefore it's going to reduce risk of heart disease. And then all of a sudden it goes from that to, if you eat chocolate, it reduces the incidence of heart disease.
Yeah, it gets extended.
Which is not what they were saying. And I think that's hard. Like, I feel like that's hard for anyone because you want to kind of extrapolate the data as much as possible. But at the same time, it's important not to kind of overextend it and turn it into something that it's not. And it's so easy for things like that, especially something like heart disease and plaque buildup, because there's so much association between the two that it's easy to just take this piece of information and change it. So it's important to actually take their results for what it is and not change it into something that it's not.
Yeah, I think that's very important. So just to wrap up, I wanted to reiterate those top 3 tips that we have for people to decipher and understand nutrition information. So our first one was context. So looking at all the parameters and all of the factors around that conclusion. My second tip is to find reputable websites, which we will link to those in the show notes actually. So we mentioned a couple. And then our third tip was to look at the big picture. Don't underestimate yourself and look at that broader view. Use your own knowledge and experiences to make your own decision. And I think those are very important to keep in mind whenever you're consuming information and media.
There's so much information out there that it's very easy to get overwhelmed. But I think if you stick to these tips
and have a critical eye, you'll be able to come to your own sound conclusions. Yes. I really think so.
Exactly.
So are we ready to wrap it up?
Yeah, I think so. That was really great. I hope you guys enjoyed this week's episode and were able to pull some useful information from it. Don't forget to like and share this video with your family and friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you can stay tuned for next week's episode. Okay. Thanks so much for listening, guys.
Thanks. Bye.